Welcome. My name is Eduard Storm. I am currently an Assistant Professor of Economics at the Carleton College in Minnesota, and I appreciate you for taking the time to take a glimpse of my job market paper on task specialization applied to the native foreign wage gap. So without further ado, how about we jump right into it? To start things off, I would like to provide a brief motivation on my paper, but I don't need more than just a few stylized facts to show you where I want to go with this. In figure number 1, specifically the two top panels, I displayed two key dimensions of the wage gap in Germany between native and foreign workers. On the left, we can see that since 2005, the wage gap increased from 13 to 20% in recent years. And on the right panel, we can see that these trends have been especially pronounced near the tails of the wage distribution. Now moving down to the bottom panel of figure 1, we can see the key emphasis of my paper, which is the workplace. In essence, what I am interested in is, what is it that workers actually do at their job? And the key takeaway from this panel is that there has been huge gaps in the tasks that native and foreign workers have been assigned to in the 1990s. Over time, however, those gaps shrank to the point that nowadays they increasingly perform the same set of tasks, at least in terms of aggregate trends. So in a nutshell, if foreign workers assimilate in terms of educational outcomes and in terms of tasks, then why do we not observe a convergence in wages? In order to answer this question, I propose 3 contributions to the literature. Contribution number 1. The aggregate trends I just showed you a moment ago, they don't do it. We have to dig deeper, and we have to take a look at the worker level in order to get a better sense of underlying sources of heterogeneity. And this matters because it challenges identifying assumptions that are commonly made in structural models, which aim to estimate the production function, while at the same time accounting for underlying skill differences in the labor aggregate L. So commonly what people do is they condition on education, they condition on experience, and subsequently we can assume, okay, now workers are perfect substitutes. Well, my findings suggest that we have to go beyond formal qualifications to get a sense for underlying skill differences. Otherwise, the resulting wage elasticities will be flawed in the sense that they underestimate the true labor market fragmentation. Contribution number 2. I decompose the contribution of tasks to the wage gap along the entire wage distribution. And I show that those idiosyncratic differences, meaning the worker level variation in tasks, contributes up to 25% to the explained wage gap. And importantly, their impact is especially pronounced among high wage earners. Now, why is that relevant? Well, keep in mind, we just saw the main action, the wage gap, takes place near the tails of the wage distribution. Problem is, conventional methods, in spirit of Waha Blinder, they only decompose evaluating mean outcomes, meaning the mean wage gap and then mean difference in covariates. But that understates the impact of tacit wage gaps because, again, that's not where the action takes place. So you got to go beyond the mean. So in that regard, I view the second contribution as a methodological contribution to the literature. Number 3, I differentiate between occupation effects and within occupation effects. Now, before I provide details, let me first clarify some terminology here. So between occupation effects are also referred to as occupational segregation and essentially captures comparative advantage in the occupational choice. Native workers tend to be specialized in occupations intensive and interactive tasks, where you have to communicate a lot, whereas foreign workers tend to be specialized in occupations intensive in manual tasks. And guess what? Those manual intensive occupations, they tend to be paid less. And that's what's ultimately driving wage disparities. And clearly we can see this is truly an economically meaningful challenge. However, that's not the key finding of my paper, because this is merely confirmation of what others before me have already shown. My novel finding, and this is to my knowledge the first finding of this kind in the literature, is that this task specialization in fact extends occupational borders and also takes place at the workplace. contributing up to 16% to the wage gap. So this is anything but trivial, and therefore previous work understates the degree of task specialization. So these are my three key contributions. Now I would like to move on and provide some more details on how I arrive at those. At the heart of my study is a series of German employment surveys containing first-hand information about the tasks that workers perform at the workplace. In figure 2, I illustrate how I utilize this valuable information in constructing task measures. In the first step, it all starts with individual activities I observe for each worker, all the way from gathering information down to guarding and observing. Then I bundle those related activities, and the next step, I aggregate them into 5 distinct task groups, whereby each task group shares some common characteristics. For instance, in the first task group, those activities, they require lots of analytic skills. Think of STEM occupations. In the second group, you have to communicate a lot, so it requires interactive skills. Combined, group 1 and group 2 involve a lot of non-routine activities, which require workers to be strong at problem-solving skills, which can be subsumed under abstract tasks. I can then proceed in a similar fashion for different types of routine tasks, which are characterized by various repetitive steps. And this feature, those repetitive steps, is prone to automation and in stark contrast to non-routine manual, because these activities require lots of hand-eye coordination, something that machines are not good at doing yet. So think of personal services to provide some perspective. Now, of particular interest to me are 2 task groups. One, those interactive ones, where we presume native workers to have an advantage in, and number 2, non-routine manual, where we presume foreign workers have the edge. So what prior research does is they use task data at the occupation level. And that implicitly and crucially assumes that within those occupations, interactive and manual tasks are equally important for native and foreign workers alike. However, for my empirical analysis, my identifying assumption is that no, the buck does not stop at the occupational level. In fact, those specialization patterns go beyond the occupational dimension and can also be seen at the workplace, at the firm level, so to say. So what I am doing then is I construct those individual task measures, capturing the relative importance of, let's say, interactive tasks relative to all the others. And then I average those individual measures out across each occupation. So that then gives me an individual task measure and an occupational task measure, where the latter provides a reference to prior research. And then I can use those two to decompose variation in tasks and its contributions to the wage gap. And importantly, I can do that across the entire wage distribution, therefore gauging their relative importance at different parts of the wage distribution. And what that looks like, you can see here in figure number 3, where I provide a peek at some key results, primarily here in this case, long-term trends. On the left panel, you can see the decomposition results for interactive tasks. On the right panel, the results for non-routine manual. Let's stick with interactive for a moment. On the vertical axis, you can see the contributions of variation in tasks to the explained wage gap, capped at 100% for clarity, and you see 2 lines here. The red dashed line comprises variation stemming from both the individual and occupational variation in tasks, whereas the blue solid line comprises only individual level variation, implying that the difference between those two captures occupational variation. So therefore, the larger the vertical distance, the more important is occupational segregation in relative terms. And we can clearly see, by and large, occupational segregation is king. No question about it, right? That's not really surprising. But the key contribution of my paper is that those idiosyncratic differences, they're anything but trivial, because they contribute up to 15% to the explained wage gap among high wage earners near the top of the wage distribution. And it doesn't end there. Because if we now move to the second panel and focus on those non-routine manual tasks, we can see that towards the bottom and even here around the middle part of the wage distribution, individual variation in manual tasks is likewise a consistent and economically meaningful contributor to the wage gap, contributing up to 10% overall. So long story short, across the board, we can see that those idiosyncratic differences in tasks at the workplace contribute to the wage gap, the bottom, the middle, and also the top part. And collectively, they are a key component to those stylized facts that we saw early on in this presentation. So to wrap things up, I would like to leave you with a couple of concluding remarks, one on theory, one on policy. First, on the theory side, I want to highlight that my findings have potentially important implications on welfare, because what this mechanism entails is that it leaves some room for native and foreign workers being complements in the production function. Now, this is nothing I elaborate on in detail in the paper, but it's certainly something worth exploring, because if we think about an immigration shock, it might induce native workers to specialize in those interactive tasks to an extent that they would have not have done without immigration. And those interactive tasks, they tend to be more productive, they tend to be compensated better than many other tasks. So this is some food for thought for the theorists among us. The second part is on policy. Usually immigration policies have a stronger focus on those between occupation effects by focusing on recognition of foreign qualifications. However, in the paper, I discussed that the task specialization that occurs within occupation has been something that has been on the rise in recent years relative to occupational characteristics. So I view this as a food for thought for policymakers in terms of the best policies, not only to attract, but especially retain skilled labor, especially in light of deteriorating demographics and therefore increased competition for skilled workers. At this point, I'm happy to refer you to the paper for more details. Otherwise, I'm happy to talk to you soon in person, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye.